Welcome to this webinar on navigating polarization as a legal professional in impact investing. We are going to have a wide-ranging conversation on how psychology can help lawyers embrace uncertainty and create value. But let me first introduce myself. My name is Svea Schoenberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Grunin Center for Law and Social Entrepreneurship here at NYU Law. It's lovely to see all of you here with us today on this webinar. But I also look forward to seeing many of you in person at our annual conference that the Grunin Center holds each year. And this year it's going to be held on June 3rd and 4th at NYU Law. So please sign up to join our mailing list or follow us on LinkedIn so you can stay up to date on when we open registration, which should be later this month. And we'll also be updating our community on the themes that we're going to be discussing at the conference, as well as speakers who are going to be joining us. So I hope to see you there. One item for housekeeping, we're going to have the chat open for audience questions throughout. We probably won't get to it until the last 15 minutes, but feel free to drop your questions in at any time and we will get to them. So thank you for that. And without further ado, I want to introduce the three people who will be speaking with us tonight. We have as our moderator, Professor Deborah Burand. She is a clinical professor of law here at NYU Law. She directs the International Transactions Clinic, and she's the faculty director for the Grunin Center. She's an expert in impact investing, social entrepreneurship, and cross-border finance. She's a former senior government official at U.S. Treasury, Federal Reserve Board, and also former general counsel of the U.S. government's Development Finance Institution. And we have Professor Diane Sivasubramaniam. She comes to us from Swinburne University in Melbourne, Australia. She specializes in justice, decision-making, and group identity. And she researches how people perceive fairness, trust institutions, and handle social conflict. She applies behavioral science to help professionals navigate complex, high-stakes environments. And we also have Professor Sam Wilson, also from Swinburne University, and he focuses on moral decision-making and societal change. He studies ethical dilemmas, leadership, and how people define the common good. He uses psychology to develop practical solutions for global challenges like sustainability and social impact. So with that, I'll turn it over to our moderator, Deborah.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the introduction, Svea. For those who have come in while Svea was speaking, just a reminder, drop questions into the chat. I will also be watching them as I engage in this conversation with Sam and Diane. And if I see a time where it just fits, where I could bring your question right into our conversation, I will. Otherwise, we will hold those for response at the end. So again, thank you, everyone. And I must say, I'm really excited because I'm seeing many names in our participants who I know and have known for a very long time. So welcome to all of you. I'll try not to do too many shout outs to you all. So as you could perhaps tell when we heard the introduction of Sam and Diane, these are really interesting scholars, researchers, and practitioners. And I had the opportunity to hear them speaking at a conference in Portugal a couple of years ago. And I ran, didn't walk, to grab them and say, you must come to our conference, because some of the issues that they were highlighting and grappling with were things that I've seen in my own legal practice as a lawyer who is working in the fields of social entrepreneurship, impact investing, and sustainable development. That was long before the world we're in today. So it may come as no surprise that as we were thinking about how to respond to some of the very recent events that are happening in the world, I reached out again to Sam and Diane and said, I could use your help. So with that, they have started to give me a framework to think about how I manage myself in this environment, how I manage my work obligations, and more importantly, as we move further, how we work together as a community in this space. So today's webinar has a pretty simple focus, but very complex conversation to take place, which is how do we, in a polarized world, continue to build a thriving and nurturing community of legal practice among deal lawyers who have decided to do good with their legal skills. The stakes have never been higher for our community of legal practice and never higher for us as professionals, I would argue. Last year at our annual conference, we began a conversation with the two of you, Sam and Diane, and we started to talk about how, as lawyers working in impact investing and social entrepreneurship, we might be influenced by unintentional biases, blind spots as we provide legal counsel to our clients. We also looked at how we might more effectively hear or see, observe, understand the needs and challenges confronting those who are the intended beneficiaries that our transactions are hoping to reach. Today, I'm coming back to you again, and thank you for being such a generous with your time and support to talk more about what I consider an existential but very personal concern that's arising in our legal community of practice. Namely, I'm hoping that in this conversation today, we'll learn from you as experts in social and organizational psychology, what you have to say about what happens to behaviors, judgment, decision-making, when people feel that they or their values are under assault or at risk. And I sort of see our conversation taking place today in three buckets. So let me just say what those buckets are, and then let's get to the conversation. The three broad buckets where I hope our conversation will take us is one, how do people respond when we're working in a polarized world? What are the behaviors we should expect to see or emotions we might expect to feel in ourselves and others? Secondly, what does this mean for us as lawyers? Lawyers who have intentionally created legal practices that are aiming to try to do good by doing deals. We're not the litigators. We're not the ones running into the courthouse right now, but that doesn't mean that our work is any less important. And third, what kind of community of legal practice should we even be trying to foster in this kind of a world? And where are boundaries? Where are opportunities? So let's go with the first, more personal. As you see, we're going to sort of spread farther and farther off, but how do people respond when they're working in a polarized world? And maybe the first question is, what are the psychological roots of polarization, and what is its influence on our behavior, judgment, and decision-making? There's sort of an assumption I made there when I said that. So tell me if I'm wrong or show me how it works.
Well, how long do we have, Deborah? And thank you very much.
I'll keep an eye on the time. Don't worry. I can cut you off because I want to get to these other issues too.
Well, Diane, maybe I can just begin with some broad sort of context to provide a bit of a broader canvas for us to then sort of project on and play with. It's probably helpful, Deborah, to think about what we even mean by polarization in the first place here. Obviously, it's a term that's used a lot, but often helpful to know what we're talking about. I think we probably all intuitively understand what we mean here, but we're essentially looking at a process in which people, as individuals or as groups of people, move towards more extreme points on a continuum of belief about a particular thing. And of course, there's no shortage of those things about which we vehemently disagree. Immigration, for example, vaccination, COVID, and climate change. There are a whole host of things that we describe, I guess, as wicked challenges or complex challenges in which we're becoming increasingly polarized and divergent in beliefs. And it's helpful to also recognize, I think, that it's while the problem is particularly acute in the US, as for example, the Edelman Trust Barometer has been measuring these things over the years. US is obviously in a case of extreme polarization, but it's also important to recognize that it's germane to the Western world. So Australia, for example, where we are, we're also on a path to polarization, not as extreme, but we see the same trends here as we do in Europe and other places. And I guess to get to the psychology of this, well, this is, as you might imagine, a very big, complex type of thing. But one of the sort of psychological phenomena that's worth calling out that corresponds with polarization is this cognitive inflexibility, this inability to perceive and apprehend and integrate and assimilate different beliefs to adapt and sort of alter your thinking. So you become sort of very kind of rigid in some respects, and unable to integrate, unable to evolve your thoughts. So there's you might say there's a sort of a relationship between polarization and cognitive inflexibility, where one begets the other in some sort of cycle.
Yeah, it almost looks like that could be a really self-perpetuating circle where one just keeps worsening, right? Is that, Diane, what would you offer to we've got inflexibility and an inability to integrate and evolve in our thinking. What other types of behaviors, and how does that affect our judgment?
I think one thing that really I think we have to consider is sort of layered on here is that on top of just the polarization, which is sort of an extreme state, there's just regular in-group, out-group dynamics that occur in daily life, right? We are very often operating in those in-group, out-group mechanisms. We are, from an evolutionary psychology perspective, we are hardwired to see differences and to know who is my group and who is not in my group, because my group is safe. My group are the people who are going to protect me. They're my allies. So we recognize very quickly who's our in-group, who's our out-group. And that in-group, out-group dynamic is just part of the everyday decisions that we make. And it has all sorts of influences on our behavior that tend to be very subtle influences. We show, for example, in-group favoritism. We favor our in-group over members of our out-group. It's a bias that pervades our decision-making. So, for example, if we're asked to allocate a resource between people, we tend to allocate more to someone who's part of our in-group. There are other very common mechanisms that operate there, like out-group homogeneity, where when we look at people who are members of the out-group, we tend to perceive them as homogenous. We see them as one type of person, and we fail to recognize distinctions, distinguish sort of nuances between people in our out-group the same way that we do in our in-group. And that leads to all sorts of errors and biases as well. So, for example, if someone who's a member of our out-group does something negative, well, that's a comment on everyone in that out-group. We overgeneralize when it comes to out-group conclusions and inferences. And so we sort of live with this in-group, out-group dynamic all the time. And another really important point, I think, about the in-group, out-group dynamic is that it's actually quite fluid in a sense, because your identity, your sort of social identity, is quite malleable, right? If you put me in a room full of women, I'm a woman. Or maybe if you put me in a room full of women, I will identify with a thing that distinguishes me from those women. So whether you identify with the people around you or identify as different from the people around you, that can be pushed around by different circumstances. But typically, if you put me in a room full of students, I'm a professor. If you put me in a room full of children, I'm an adult. We recognize those differences, we categorize ourselves accordingly. So your social identity in any given situation is malleable because you don't have a single social identity, right? You're not just a professor or just a woman or just an adult. You are all of those things, and what is salient will shift in different circumstances. And so this in-group, out-group dynamic that we live with every day is actually quite a fluid thing. It's constant, but how it operates is fluid. Polarization is a little bit different, because polarization is where you see a fundamental difference between you and another person, or between your group and another group, and that difference is insurmountable. There is something fundamental and something sort of unshakable there, and it tends to coalesce around moral positions. So if you occupy a different moral space from somebody else, that's where polarization can really, I suppose, invade our very normal in-group, out-group daily dynamic. So that's what I would say to add. I think just that, just that in-group, out-group complexity to the polarization issue. This is, in a way, not anything new. Polarization is not anything new. It's just, it's kind of an extreme and more calcified version of something very normal that we live with daily.
Go
I
ahead,
think
Sam. I want to take it one more step, but go ahead, please.
I'm just curious how it's you're right, Diane. It's helpful to sort of recognize that these in-group, out-group dynamics, they're not sort of dysfunctional, and they're not aberrant. They're very natural, and they're a very natural part of just what it means to be human, a part of a sort of a part of a natural sort of threat response as well, where the group will band together, and it's important to have that social cohesion that, of course, helps us to think with the same moral mind and to coordinate and with one another. So very adaptive. But I think with polarization, it's there's interaction, I think, between polarization and those in-group, out-group dynamics that Diane was talking about, where it can really foster some sort of like a conflict mentality, us against them, where we're good, they're bad, and they're a threat, which in turn increases the need for you to sort of cohere. And of course, to Diane's point about how we perceive other groups as being homogeneous and largely sort of fungible. Of course, with under polarization, the in-group itself becomes more homogeneous too. We all begin to think, there's pressure to think more and more similarly, and to sort of show that you sort of think similarly. And so that may come back to a third bucket a bit later, Deborah. But there are certainly pressures there to conform and to sort of signal that you believe many of the same things, whether you do or not. And so this has implications for community that we can perhaps return to a bit later. But I think one sort of final little wrinkle I'd had here is that, and this is also something we can return to, is that when we become polarized and we stick more to our own groups and navigate our groups of liberals or in the rest of the world, sort of social democrats, as I guess we're talking about, and conservatives, we tend to become rather adapted to those groups, and there's a risk of what's called rigid cognitive specialization, where we become very specialized to our group and thinking and behaving in ways which conform with expectations and norms and so forth. And that's all very good and well, up to the point where you have to exist and work constructively in a shared power world.
You know, one of the things that I'm getting from this conversation that I think is quite interesting is how they feed on each other. And I think that's really interesting. And as you, I think, maybe put it, we start going, while some of this is always happening, the polarization pushes us to the far edges and perhaps makes some of these behaviors or thought processes more extreme, even more inflexibility, even more rigidity, even less willingness to take in information that might suggest a more nuanced understanding of people who disagree with us or we believe disagree or don't honor or respect our values. And, you know, I think this is why, and I'm going to use this as our pivot to our next bucket. I think this is why I felt that our community, this community, and I'm sounding very tribal as I say this. So you guys can stop me when I start doing I'm role modeling the behavior you just described. But I think it goes to the question of when you're in a community where you have identified yourself as someone who is value-led. And I think this is a group of lawyers who have done that. I don't think it's a group of lawyers who have all lined up to advance the same values. There may be some similarities, but I think where we first come together is that we are trying to manifest our values in our professional capacity. We're not leaving it at the door when we walk into the workplace, or at least not every door. There may be some doors we leave it at. So I guess what I'd like to shift with is to really talk now about how and make that leap to how our work as lawyers who are active in the fields of social entrepreneurship, impact investing, sustainable development. How does this work in our world? And some of us are in academic institutions where we're teaching the next generation of lawyers to practice in these fields. I see a former student of mine in this room with us today, which is just so lovely. Some of us are working in house and corporations or in government foundations or charitable institutions. Others are in law practices where they're advising clients whose business models and impact goals and financial sustainability are at risk now. So I wonder if we could take that shift of what might be happening, observing in ourselves or in our personal engagements, and put it into a workplace. And let me again give a big nod to the lawyers who are rolling up their sleeves, their litigation sleeves, and going into the courtroom. But our work is really now in the boardroom. And so how do we navigate this as business-oriented lawyers? Let me just open that up for you.
Yeah, I might have just another general sort of thing, and leave the deep, rich context and so forth for you to expand upon. I wonder, Deborah, as we talk about values and so forth, whether it's worth even sort of thinking about what we mean by this as well in a way that might lead us not to overstate differences between groups. And so values are obviously these abstract things that we sort of value in the world, and reflects our attention on what we try to foster. But one thing I guess is helpful to remember in the context of polarization is that even groups that seem to be very different may not be so different in terms of their values at a sort of fundamental level. So, for example, the work of the social psychologist Kurt Gray, he does a lot of work looking at this notion that we all have the same moral mind. And I guess it sort of extends and builds upon, and to some extent is quite different to the work of, say, Jonathan Haidt, looking at different moral foundations. But the point of Kurt Gray's work is to suggest that we all of us have the same moral mind. We all want to protect people from harm. But one of the differences here is that we disagree about who is worthy, who is harmed, and who is worthy of protection from harm. And this might be just a helpful thing to put in because, of course, our conversations when we first met, Deborah, were about entrepreneurship and impact investing and creating a social good, broadly defined. But of course, it's also important to bear in mind that we are motivated to reduce harms. And this brings in your work on injustice and justice, Diane. But, you know, we disagree. We all want to protect people from harm. We disagree, though, about the threats. And so that might be helpful to think about when we think about the values that we bring, because at a deep fundamental level, there is a similarity. There may be more that's similar than different.
I'm feeling a rigidity and inflexibility to even as you speak, Sam, but go ahead, Dion. Convince me that I've got to integrate that into my thinking. Go ahead.
I actually think there's a couple of different sides to this coin. I think I think what Sam has sort of presented us with is sort of probably the better angels of our nature. And what I might do is acknowledge the other side of us, which is that people at an individual level are feeling under siege, essentially, which I think is important to acknowledge, because that's really the thing that's going to be driving a lot of these effects on behavior and cognition and affect or feeling. There is a feeling of being under siege. And so I want to, I suppose, think about what that actually means for people, because I think people, when they feel like they are under siege, when there's a real threat, when they feel like they are under attack, whether or not that's true, I think taking Sam's point, but when people feel they are under attack, people go into really sort of a fight or flight response. And I think that's what people are sort of sitting with at the moment. I think people are in this space right now where they are figuring out fight or flight. Do I hide and just try and get through these next few years, or do I fight? And what does that look like? And so I think it's important to acknowledge that there is an actual stress response that people are undergoing at the moment, and that we know that those stress responses have many impacts on people's cognitions and affect and behaviors. I think those stress responses underpin all of the things that we've just talked about: the in-group, out-group, salience, polarization, that feeling of out-group homogeneity, that need to really be loyal to the in-group, things that prevent dissent from in-group opinions, because, you know, if you dissent from your in-group, well, that could allow the out-group in, that could make you vulnerable to that out-group threat. And that's a very real thing that people are feeling at the moment. It's also difficult, I think, in this community because you're a community that operates in a very complex space. And particularly in my mind, that complexity lies around the fact that, and I remember talking about this at the conference in June, the thing that I find fascinating about impact investing is that you have these two goals that are supposed to operate kind of in tandem. There's the goal of sort of financial benefit, but also the goal of social benefit. And that's actually a really complex thing for people to hold in their minds, those two goals at the same time, when often people have perhaps a stereotype that those two things are a trade-off. If you are going for social benefit, well, there's a trade-off with financial benefit, that those two things can't actually operate in tandem. So you already have a very complex task, and stress and threat, they are not a friend to complexity. When things are stressful and threatening, everything gets very simplified and very basic. We are thinking with our hindbrains. We're not employing executive function, this prefrontal cortex that took a long time to evolve in the human brain. That's not really an operation at times of stress or threat. We become reptilian in relying on our hindbrains. And so you're in a very complex space to be operating under a perception of threat and hostility. And I think that's really one of the most important things to acknowledge about how this impacts your community. The need to maintain that very deliberative and values-led thinking in the face of this outgroup hostility.
I agree, John. And if I can just build upon that, I see this as a real strength too, that notion that of thinking in a very sort of careful way rather than it's sort of a heuristic, reflexive type of way. A lot of our thinking is reflexive and we rationalize things after the fact, but we've already kind of made up our mind. And this, I think, Diane, is a real asset in the community. And I'm reminded here, and building upon your comment about tribes earlier, Deborah, Joshua Green, another social psych, wrote a book years ago called Moral Tribes. And really sort of the point he was really getting at, I think, is that we think fast and slow generally, but also we think fast and slow in terms of moral thinking as well. And our fast moral thinking might be sort of very like outrage, or might be driven by these in-group, out-group dynamics as well. But there's also a slower form of moral thinking as well, where we can integrate these different bits and pieces and refute or push back against the simplification of information, which is another driver of polarization. So we can keep bringing in the nuance, keep it there. And this nuance, of course, is a way where we might find some common ground and to maybe apprehend and resolve some of the tensions that Diane mentioned between social good and financial capital as well, which of course is germane to social entrepreneurship.
You know, so interesting. Many of us on this call, or those who will even be watching this later, are probably in a position not unlike my own, where I am advising clients who are very stressed out right now, very worried. They are in that should we fight or should we flight kind of flee mode. And it's challenging because facts are opaque. Figuring out, as a lawyer, I like to sort of play a bit of a chess, anticipate. I call myself a professional worrier. I'm paid to worry on behalf of other people. Well, my clients' worries have gone so far beyond mine that I'm racing to catch up, right? And so what does this mean for us practically? What are practical strategies that we can take, managing not only our own equilibrium, but I sometimes feel, and maybe I shouldn't be taking this on, but I sometimes feel that I need to bring some equilibrium into the room. I need to help my clients do what you just talked about, Sam, which is, and Diane, which is to avoid a simplification of information, to actually say, this is complicated. What